And in many ways, this story is indicative of those questions. On top of that, you have even within Chazal kind of stirot, questions about this Maaseh of David. And so what I propose is today, more or less, we're going to focus on the Pshat. We're going to go through, again, at a very, not at such a deep level, but pointing out, analyzing a little bit, having a look, getting into the story to see, with my kind of pointers, so to speak. And then we're going to, in the weeks after, we're going to look at Chazal, at the Mefarshim, at the approaches in Chazal, and how we make sense of it all, right? How we understand, firstly, how the various shittot of how we understand it in Chazal, the sin of David, if there was a sin, if there wasn't a sin. Famously, we know the Gemara that says, anyone who says that David is a sinner, it must be mistaken, right? But there are other Gemaras. But how do we explain that versus the pshat? How we meant to understand that? What's the right approach to us in general? Because obviously we know this isn't the only question we have by the avot. We know that other avot seemingly engaged in sin. We also know that Chazal in some places say you can't say that about them. Anyone that says that Reuven sinned with Bilhah is in error. And so we're going to engage really with those questions. So that's what I suggest we do. We begin from the story and see from there exactly where it leads us. And hopefully it'll be a very fruitful kind of encounter with the sources and also with Chazal. Does anyone want to say anything or comment at this point? Questions? No, I will just say at the outset, it was very interesting for me, was that I don't remember when it was because it's all such a blur. Maybe Shavuot. I think we put together with some of the shuls a kind of a learning before, like a few sessions before with shrubs, and I suggested to the Rabbanim that they, together with myself, talk about the sin of David and Bathsheba, right, or how we relate to the sins of Chazal. And what blew me away from that discussion, I don't know if anyone was there, if they remember, was that there was not that much difference between what I had to say and what they had to say, which surprised me, right? I think I was talking with Rabbi Eisenberg, Rabbi Simmons, Rabbanim Min Ashura, but come from a different world from me, more or less, I would say. And we said basically the same thing. It blew me away because in Israel, not between the Haredim and the Mizrahi, so to speak, the Dati Leumi, but within the Dati Leumi, there is a huge argument on this question about how David and Bathsheba should be read, about how we read the sins or the non-sins of the Avot. And it's something which is a real burning issue. There's a newspaper called Makor Rishon, which my wife and I missed terribly, which is like the newspaper of the Dati Leumi in Israel that you get every Shabbos. I see your hand, Jonathan. And it's like a proper newspaper. It's not like a few pages. It's like different sections, and there's one section which deals with Mekorot and Halacha and all different and Machshava. And every few months, there's someone writes an article, a Rav or someone talking about how we learn Tanakh and how we approach these questions. And then for the next few weeks, that's what they're dealing with, right? And people write back and people argue. And there's a big this divide between the various yeshivot and various approaches on this particular question. Jonathan, you want to say something?
Oh, just two things. One on the share and something else. I don't know what it is. Someone's breathing. I don't know if they're over a fan or something, but I don't know if anyone else is getting it's like someone's so blowing over the microphone.
Maybe if everyone could mute, and if it's me, let me know.
Well, no, there's not much we can do about it. It's just
me, you're stuck.
Yeah.
If it's me,
just let you carry on breathing.
Yeah, right, yeah, you can still breathe, but just do it quietly. No, my Rebbe said something actually very interesting regarding Yosef HaSadik, because it sort of ties in with the story of David. Is that if you look, Yosef, to a certain extent, he was on his way to fail when he went to Potipharah, or if that was what her name was. So the point was, his godless came through, his sidkus came through the fact that he failed, And I think sometimes that we put even today, we put people on such a pedestal, yet sometimes their failures are actually part of what makes them who they are.
Yeah.
You have it with Boaz as well, that he died on the night of his marriage to Ruth. At the time, people must have been saying terrible things about him. The thing is, we don't know if we transport ourselves. How would we have viewed these people at the time where they failed? Like in ourselves, it's a difficult thing. I'm forgetting English at this time of night. But basically, if we were to be living at this particular point in time, or if we were to have a famous rabbi in our point of time who failed in some way, shape, or form, but we don't always allow them to come back, so to speak.
Mm.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you view that. I mean, just anyone, how we view that in the bigger picture of things is we're very used to short fixes and not seeing the long view, whereas Boaz saw the long view, so to speak. It went beyond his life. I suppose to a certain extent in this case as well, David, it went beyond because he knew what
we will see that as well. I think that's a healthy approach, right? There's something very unique about the Tanakh in its ancient Near Eastern context, in that it mentions the sins of people and mentions the misgivings of really the spiritual giants, and who is greater than David, right? Not only as for what he represents in his lifetime, but for what he represents in the future in the Yomot Mashiach. And there's something quite extraordinary in the context. We're not going to do more comparisons, not at least not this round, right? In the context of ancient Near Eastern texts, right? Because and I said this before, in ancient Near Eastern texts, the role of the text was to protect the status of the king, oftentimes, whereas here it's the exact opposite, right? And that's part of the uniqueness of.
You have it with Rav Nachman as well. Is that there's a book written about him, I think by his servant, and talks about he went through depression and this and that. Yeah. And it's quite amazing to see. Maybe today, because we're brought up on a diet of our Gedolim don't make mistakes.
Well, yeah. So that's a whole other question which we can talk about. There's a famous book, My Uncle the Netziv, right? That was put in Cherem because it was translated into English. They cast the Netziv in a light that was humane. But I think that is an important educational question, right? I don't think it's one way or the other. I think there is room to argue that we want and perhaps the message of the Peshat is we want our Gedolim, so to speak, to be human, to teach us that we too have the ability to make mistakes and do tshuva, and the ability to reach greatness as well, perhaps. But at the same time, we do want, and I think this is a strand in Chazal, and also today definitely in certain circles, we do want our children, and also for us to think of them and understand them that we're talking about Gedolim. We're talking about people who were on another Madrega, and in that sense, I think that's an important thing to think about. But we'll see. Let's begin with the Peshat. Does everyone have a Tanakh? Everyone's got it in front of them. Shmuel Bet Yud Aleph. That's where we're starting. Obviously, Shmuel is I think it's almost one of my favorite sefers in terms of literary and how it's developed, and the figures of David and how it's presented. We enter here in Shmuel Aleph just preceding a war that David wins. And Israel wins before Aram, one of the great superpowers. Now let's read, and we're just going to read relatively pshat, relatively basically. Vehi l'tshuvat hashana, right? Perhaps it means it was a year after this. Le'et set hamelachim, at the time when kings go out. V'yishlach David et Yoav ve'et avadav, imo ve'et kol Yisrael. V'yashchitu et bnei Ammon. V'yatzu al Rabbah. So it was the time of year when kings normally go out. We don't think of war in this sense, but in the ancient Near East, and probably I assume in all the world, until very recently, the kings went out every year around March, right, when the weather got good, and they went to fight and collect taxes from the people that were more or less under their control. That was called control. And those that didn't would be surrounded and destroyed. And so this was how things happened. David is now a king, right? And he sends them out, as is the way to go out. What's important here, and this is what the text is focusing on, is that David sends them. He doesn't go out. We'll see in a second. And he sent Joab, his big general, Bet Avadav, and his servants, referring perhaps to his servants who are the special fighters, right? The real Imor, Bet Kol Yisrael, all of Israel goes out. V'yashchitu et Bnei Ammon, right? They destroy Bnei Ammon. V'yatzu al Rabbah, and they come and put a siege on Rabbah, one of the cities. V'David Yoshev b'Yerushalayim, and David sits in Yerushalayim. This picture is exactly what the text wants us to think. Everyone is going out, and David is where? He's at Yerushalayim. All of the kings go out at this time of year. All of Am Yisrael go out at this time of year, and David is at home. In fact, the Mefarshim, some of them point to the fact that that is the cause, or that's part of the cause of this Maaseh, right? The Malbim particularly, right? That David, he was there when everyone else wasn't. But on a simple level, it's highlighting the fact this is what David did at this point, which is problematic. David is meant to go in front of the troops, right? That's how the king goes, as we speak about in Bamidbar and other places. It was at the time of that night. Now, Ha'erev could be that night, that very night when they sent them away with Heya Yediyah. It could mean that night, meaning that night when this act happened. Vayakom David me'al mishkavo, and David gets up from his bed, right? And in that sense, just I have at least this perhaps isn't the pshat, but I have in my mind the Gemara in Brachot that spoke about David getting up b'chatzot halayla, right? And doing holy things. But he rises from his bed, v'yithalech al gag Beit HaMelech, and he walked on the roof of the king's house, the ancient houses, how we find many of them today in Israel as well, especially amongst Arab communities, that are flat-roofed houses, right? And so it's possible to walk on the roof. Some of them actually point to the fact that V'talech also hints at the role that the king is meant to play, right? That he's meant to V'talech in front of the troops, and here is V'talech alagag, right? Meaning he's taken on the position which he's not meant to have. He's meant to be the king that goes out and walks in front of it. He is the king at home walking on the roof. And he saw a woman washing or bathing above the roof. And we'll see next week when we look at Chazal, they talk about what happened, right? How could it be that she was bathing above the roof? And apparently there was a screen that was broken, and then David saw her. The rechitza here, as we'll see, is tied to her being a nidah and preparing for the mikveh itself. That we'll see as well in the pshat. However, I will just say, if we separate ourselves from that and talk about the very pshat, why would she be rochetzet alagag, right? Putting if we look at the text really just as pshat, maybe the text is also kind of intimating that Sheva had a hand in what was going on, but that's just a thought to have in your mind. Vayisha tovat mar'eh me'od. She is very beautiful. Okay. V'yishlach David, and David sends v'yidrosh li'isha, and to find out about her. V'yomer, and he was told, or the shaliach said, Halo zot bat Sheva bat Eliam, Peshat Uriah Hachiti. Is that not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah Hachiti? Interestingly, Bathsheba here is called by the name of her father and the name of her husband. Usually throughout Tanakh, a woman who is unmarried is called via her father, and a woman who is married is referred to via her husband. And here you have both, perhaps to teach us that she was miyuchas, right? She was of a distinguished family, so to speak. By the way, if anyone has questions, please stop.
I was just wondering why he Vayakam David Me'al Mishkavo. Why is he like having a sleep in the middle of the day or something? What's going on with that?
No, it's at night.
Is it like late at night?
Well, Chazal said it was Sheinat Tzoraim, right?
Yeah, the English, I've got an English one that's commentary that says 8 means late afternoon. It was having a siesta, basically, as we would call it.
Yeah. And that as well is a kind of a continuation of this theme. Where are the men at this point? They're on the battlefield. And David is sleeping, right? And he's able to get up like a real that's the picture that's painted of David HaMelech. V'yishlach David malachim. And David sends messengers. V'yikacheha. And he takes her. Right? And this similar shon is also found in Esther, meaning he takes her against her will. V'tavoilav. V'yishkavima. And she enters and he sleeps with her. V'hi mitkadeshet mitumata. It was exactly the time when she left this status of being me'ah. V'tashov el beita, and she returns to her house. So the actual action that's taking place here, if we just see it in terms of the words, right, is very quick. And that's part of what the text is trying to teach us. It was a very quick thing. V'yishlach David, v'yikichea, v'tavo ela, v'yishkav ima, v'yimitkadesh v'tashov el beita. Right? And that is exactly what's happening. And here as well, mitkadesh mitumata ties into the fact she was rochetzet al hagag, right? She was washing to prepare for the mikvah. V'tahar ha'isha, and she became pregnant. V'tishlach v'taged David, and she sent to David, v'tomer hara anochi, and she says, I am pregnant. Right? So now David has a big problem. What is he to do? And what does he try to do? Right? Because this looks really bad. He's essentially committed one of the most serious sins. And we'll see again how Chazal understand this, because everything we know about David speaks against this. Right? It's one thing to read the story in the Peshat and in a very narrow context. Another thing to read it in a broader context, not about David in the eyes of Chazal, but even David in the eyes of Shmuel, right? What could have led him to act in this way? And that's where as well we start to ask questions about, well, what is the sin? Or is there room to see that David could have done what he did correctly, even if it wasn't righteously? And perhaps that's what we'll talk about next week. V'yishlach David el Yoav, and David sent to Yoav saying, Shlach elai, send to me Uriah Achiti. Send to me Uriah Achiti. V'yishlach Yoav et Uriah el David. And Yoav sent him to David. So what's David planning? What are we meant to think? If we've never read the story before, it's building a kind of a sense of suspense within us, right? How's David going to get out of this? V'yavo Uriah elav, and Uriah comes to him. V'yish'al David l'shalom, and he asks how David is. L'shalom Yoav, how Yoav is. V'lishlom ha'am, how is the nation. V'lishlom ha'milchama, and how is the war going. Now, I have a question before we go anywhere. What is Uriah thinking when all of this happens? Uriah is someone who's well known. He's one, as we'll see, he's one of the important people in the war. He's not like Yoav, but he's lichor, an important kind of general. What is Uriah thinking? Jonathan, you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to answer your question. I think probably if I was him, I was thinking, why don't you come out to the battlefield and find out?
That's one thing. Why don't you come out? But more than that, why is he calling me? What were you going to say, Shmuel?
First of all, why is he called Hachiti?
Okay, that's a whole question. It could be that he was from Bnei Achiti, but we'll see Chazal speak about this as well. This element perhaps to his identity, right? But why is he called Uriah if he's a Chiti? Uriah being Urka, right? Hashem hu ori.
It sounds like if I
Because
if I
there's
was
also
Uri,
Achimelech Achiti, right? Yeah.
if I was Uriah, I would think, well, David is just asking me for reports of what's happening in the war. Those are all the questions that he's asked. Why is he asking me? Because I'm one of the important people, so he's called for me to give a report.
Right, but it's strange, no? I mean, he could get a shaliach, and we see in a few minutes there a letter sent. That's part of what we have to think as well. What's Uriah thinking to himself? Does Uriah know something's up? Why is it? We're in the middle of a war, and one of the machas on the battlefield, and the king's calling me back. And what happens when I get there? He's like, "No, Uriah, how's Yoav doing? Is he all right?" And the people, they're happy, and the war's going good. It's going good. Like, what's going on? Why you called me here? What are you asking me for? I could have sent this to you by a letter, right?
Presumably, it must have been out of, as you said, the wars were pretty common, so it must have been out of. This obviously wasn't the norm to have this sort of reporting back.
Yeah,
And the behaviour gets weirder, doesn't it? And you see, it all starts sort of.
The behaviour gets weirder, as we'll see.
Yeah.
And the other thing, which is more important, which we should have in our mind as we read this, what does David think about Uriah? What does David think about Uriah? Meaning, I don't know about you, right? But with your kids, yeah. You know when they're lying, right, or they're not telling 100% the truth, and you kind of, and not my kids. I'm talking about other kids, right? but you don't know really what's going on, but you know something's going on, right? And then the kids realize this, but they don't realize it. They think and they start acting weirdly. That's a little bit how I think of David in this circumstance. The very stress of what's going on causes David to start thinking, hang on, does Uriah know? Like, did someone tell him? Right? It's not as though this, although it was a quick act and it was very, one sentence in the psukim, so to speak, and the words are very short and sharp. It wasn't the only person involved. There were other people involved. Other people knew, right? Yoav Uriah didn't just come from the battlefield. He was probably someone sent, a shaliach, and he came on a horse, and other people were with him. Did someone tell him? Right? Even if other people didn't tell him, what does David think? David, at this point, is in a
It's clear that other people knew because David had sent for Bathsheba.
Yeah,
whoever the messenger was knew she'd been there.
There were other people. It's not just David, right? And so even if the other people didn't tell Uriah, as we read the next lines, we have to think about what David is worried about, and especially in a situation of stress and worry, that it becomes worse, right? So let's just read. V'yomer David l'Uriah, and David says to Uriah, Red leveitecha, go to your house, urchatz raglecha, and wash your legs. V'yetze Uriah mi beit hamelech. By the way, to beitecha also means to your wife. V'yetze Uriah mi beit hamelech, and Uriah leaves the house of the king. V'tetzeh acharav masat hamelech, and after him comes the food essentially from the king, right? He sent him. He said, go home, wash yourself. I'll send food with you, right? The food from the table of the king, very honorable food. What's David trying to do? If we read on the Peshat, he's trying to cover it up. He wants him, okay, I've asked you how the war is. Maybe it's something that's a bit weird, a bit out of place, but it's not entirely out of place. Sometimes it may have happened. Sometimes there's something else going on that Uriah doesn't, he knows something must be going on, and the king might be checking something, he's not sure. And David sends him, go home, right? Because David wants him to sleep with Sheva in order to perhaps hide what's going on. What does Uriah do? Veishkav Uriah petach beit hamelech. And Uriah lies at the gate of the house of the king, but kol avdei Adonai, with all of the servants of the king, velo yarad el beito. and he didn't go to his house. So it didn't work, what David perhaps wanted. Yagidu David, and it was told to David, Lemor lo yarad Uriah el beito. Uriah it didn't work. The plan didn't work.
Sorry to interrupt. It's interesting because you imagine that maybe the story would have been that David himself wanted to marry Bathsheba, but it seems to be the first solution is just a cover-up. And had Uriel done what he was supposed to have done, Bathsheba may not have become queen.
Yeah. And that, by the way, ties into other things we see in Chazal and our Masoret, that David was miyuad for Bathsheba, really. And actually the child that comes from Bathsheba becomes Shlomo Melech, which is the continuation of the Davidic line, right? But that's also hinted at through these lines, the fact that he didn't go and it didn't work out, perhaps also teaches us something. But V'yomer David Uriah, and David says to Uriah, Halomi derech ataba, have you not come from a long way? Madua lo yaradata el beitecha. Why have you not gone down to your house? Right? One thing we have to also keep in mind, and this is also partially how we'll see Chazal read this, is how do we understand this conversation? This isn't a conversation between friends. This is a conversation between king and servant. And that's an important distinction. But David says, why haven't you gone down to your house? Haven't you come from a far way away? Right? V'yomer Uriah David, and Uriah says to David, Haaron v'Yisrael v'Yehuda yoshvim b'Sukkot. He says the Aaron and Am Yisrael and Yehuda, the different armies, are sitting either in Sukkot mamash, right? Actually dwelling in a sukkah, because they're in the field, they're in tents or Sukkot, or perhaps in the place Sukkot, which is perhaps a staging area for battle there. Vadoni Yoav, and my Adoni, which is an important word here. Yoav Avdei Adoni, and my servants, right? Al Pnei Sadeh, in the field, Chonim, they're parked, they're dwelling. Vani Avoel Beiti, and I'm going to go to my house, to my wife. Le'echol ve'lishtot ve'lishkav im ishti, to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife. Chayecha v'chay nefshecha im e'eseh davar hazeh. He makes an oath saying, I will not do such a thing. Now this line for Chazal becomes pivotal, but even in the story, this line is pivotal and actually can be read two ways. One way is Uriah saying something quite legitimate, right? He even showing to David in a very innocent kind of way how committed he is to his general Yoav, and how committed he is to his troops, and how much of a mensch he is, right? And we all, again, I don't know if you know people like this, but I know people like this in Israel. I'm not a commander, right? I'm just, as we say in Hebrew, a chapash, a chayal pashut. I'm a simple foot soldier, right? But we know that there are commanders that are like this. I'm not going to, I don't get time off if my soldiers are in the field. I'm with them, right? The late Rabbi Ronsky, who was the previous two chief rabbis of the army, used to go with them into battle, right? That's part of my tafkid. How can I let the soldiers go into battle? Okay, so I'm the chief rabbi of the army, but I'm going to go into battle with the mefakdim. And so that's one way of reading it. He's a mensch, he's a soldier, that's what he's doing. There's another way of reading it, and it's how David might read it, for two reasons. One, because just how it sounds to David, and two, because of the situation that David is in. How does it sound to David if he says, everyone's out to battle, am I going to go to my house? What does that sound like to David?
I think it's a bit of a dummy indictment, isn't it? Because on the one hand, he's actually saying, maybe David, you should be out there doing that. But not only that, but actually, instead of him going down to his house, David has done that for him. So actually, David has done both things. And he's saying on both counts, you've done both things that you shouldn't have been doing. You should have been somewhere else.
Yeah. there is definitely in this line an indictment of the actions of David, and David can hear that as that hearing that way. How does he refer to Yoav? Yoav being the general. Adoni Yoav, my master Yoav. Would it ever think to someone to say such a thing in front of the king? To refer to someone else below him as Adoni?
Well, he's already ignored the king, hasn't he?
He's ignored the command of the king to go down to his house, right? And he's responded perhaps in a way that can be interpreted badly. And I don't know about now, kings and queens don't mean very much. I know here a little bit they press like to follow them, but they don't really mean very much. But when you're dealing with a real king that can kill you or let you live, right, at the drop of a hat, Saddam, Lahavdil, Saddam Hussein, when you're talking to Saddam Hussein, you don't talk in a way that could be understood l'gnai l'shevach. You talk only l'shevach, right? Because on the off chance he misunderstands what you're saying, it never ends quite well for you, right? In fact, it ends very poorly, and that's the case here. And more than that, I saw some video clip that this guy tried to break as many ridiculous rules as he could in England, right? In a day. He apparently looked up on the law books and found all these like weird laws, right? Like you're not allowed to walk holding a fish or something in the marketplace in a suspicious manner that are still on the law books in this country. So one of the things, he walked into Buckingham Palace, he walked into Westminster in a suit of armor. Apparently there's still a law in your country that if you do that, you're chayav mitah, right? They can kill you. And so he did that. He got dressed up in armor and walked in, and he explained to the policeman what he was doing, and they let him in, right? But you understand, because walking into the government with armor is a declaration of war, right? Or a declaration of a coup. So too, perhaps referring to the big general of the king as Adoni could be understood in that way as well, right? That doesn't sound good to a king. And also, as I said before, does David think that Uriah knows or that he doesn't know? What does he know? And it's enough for David to suspect this, that he reads this line also as Uriah hinting at his act with Bathsheba. You think I'm going... What?
It's interesting that including in the things that Uriah says, could I do this, includes Lishkavish.
Exactly.
You normally would you mention that under normal circumstances?
Exactly. And that's what David is thinking, right? He's thinking, does Uriah know? Is he messing with me? Right? And that's part of what's going on here. It's a very tense scene if you think about it. V'yomer David el Uriah, and David says to him, Shev b'zeh gam hayom, sit here also today, u'machar eshalchecha, and tomorrow I will send you, v'yeshev Uriah b'Yerushalayim, and Uriah sits in Yerushalayim, b'yomahu u'mimacharat, the next day. V'yikra lo David, and David calls to him, v'yochal lefanav, v'yesht v'yishakrehu, right? He feeds him and he gets drunk with him. V'yetzeh be'erev lishkav mishkavo. What was this plan B that David had in mind for Uriah? Okay, the first time I tried, it didn't work. Because he was being an honest guy, he didn't want to do it, I understood, okay. Now, let's stay a couple of days, let's drink, maybe he'll get drunk. And here the text, if you read it very carefully, plays with us a little bit, right? V'yetzeh be'erev, he goes out in the night, lishkav, to sleep. What did David hope? To sleep with his wife. B'mishkavo, im avdei adonav. Right? And us as readers, we kind of want it to happen, but it doesn't. Right? Ve'el beito le'yorad, but he doesn't go to his house. Again, the text is playing with us as well. Right? It's very playful, I would say. That's kind of a word I would use. And then David goes to plan C. And was in the morning, and in the morning, David wrote a book, a letter to Yoav, and he sent in the hand of Uriah, obviously stamped, so Uriah could read it, a secret message. And perhaps now Uriah understands why the king called him, right? Or that's how it seems to Uriah. That really the king called him, he had a special delivery to make, to a special message he wanted to tell Yoav about the war that he only trusted one of David's, one of his big generals to hand the letter to Yoav, right? If you send Mashlamcha to the general, you can send that in the hand of a regular person. But if you want to tell the general something secret about the war and you're worried the general person is going to ruin the secret, you send it in the hand of someone who's trusted. So when Uriah leaves David's palace, he feels as though someone that's now he understands what this whole thing was about. Uriah. Jonathan, you want to say something?
Yeah, I did actually. It's interesting because I have learned this before, but you just whiz through it. Is that we traditionally learn that because he was married to Malchus, that was it. That was his death sentence. But David seems to have been ready to forego that if the drinking plan had worked.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting. It was really because normally you say it's almost. I would understand married Malchus was always almost outside of the king's hands. Once you've done something like that, that was it. It was like if you imagine like about Achashverosh, we had the Sharvitz and all that sort of stuff. Is that if even Esther had to follow the rules, and if she would have broken the rules, she would have also got in trouble. There was a certain point where Achashverosh was also trapped by the rules of kingship and protocol. Yet David seemed to put that into his, as you would put it, his plan C.
Yeah. Exactly. So what Jonathan is talking about is Chazal that say, how could David do this to Uriah? He was Mored b'malchut, right? He was, and I pointed that out quite clearly in the text, in the words of Uriah. He refused to listen to David, and therefore he was chayav mita. I'll add one thing though to what Jonathan says, another kushia on that Chazal. If he was Mored b'malchut, if he was rebelling against the king, and for him to disregard the king's command to go to his house is enough to be considered Mored b'malchut, right? So why not kill him? Why do you send him to battle in this kind of backside way to kill him? He's Mored b'malchut, so okay, right? Take him to the wall and shoot him, or whatever they did then, right?
But if David doesn't directly orders his death, then it makes it perhaps even more obvious to people who know what's going on. He then takes Sheva. It makes it look really bad.
Exactly. That's exactly the point. Okay, so
say not necessarily everybody else knew about. It's hard to do like a crossway conversation on Zoom, but not necessarily everybody else knew about that. It would have only been a couple of people.
But they would have known about it once she gave birth, and Uriah hadn't slept with her because he was away at war.
They don't know the business. Technically, as well. Don't get me wrong. Is that people don't know what other people's business is in general. Uriah still came back home. It's only the king that was sort of had his eye on the situation because it benefited him. But I don't know. I mean,
I don't think
really interested in what other people are doing in that respect?
I disagree. I think people would have known and people would have seen. And also, you have to understand the ancient city was not like cities today. Right, where it's like these expanses. How a few houses together, everyone sees everyone else.
That's what I was just thinking. Just right at the beginning, I didn't want to ask it. Is that how comes David was seeing what was going on? You imagine the palace being separate from somebody else's, or at least his palace being quite separate from other people.
Well, it was separate, but it was on the hill, right? I'm sure everyone here has been to Ir David, the city of David, which is ancient Yerushalayim. It was on a hill. It's a very steep hill going down. Then everyone knows what I'm talking about, right? If you leave from the Kotel and go out of the walls of the old city, you see ancient Jerusalem in front of you. Because the king's palace was higher, and all the houses were below it, right? So necessarily the king saw everything, and was above the other houses. I will just let's just finish up here this last pasuk, and then we'll end. I'll say one last thought. Veichtov b'sefer le'emor, he wrote in the letter saying, Havu et Uriah el mul pnei ha'milchama, bring Uriah in front of the war, right? In the lead in line. Pnei ha'milchama chazakah, when the battle gets fierce. Veshavtem acharav, and return away from him, right? Behind him. V'nikav emet. He gives the order, right? Make it look like he was killed in war. Send him in front. Pull back at whatever time, right? 10 people are charging the war, and then everyone knows at a certain signal, everyone retreats except for Uriah, and it makes it look like he was killed in battle, and that's what the order David gives. And again, even if he was Mored b'Malchut, it looks very bad for David that this is what he was trying to do, right? Even if it's not what we would expect in terms of Ehrlichkeit, right? And perhaps that's part of how we read this going forward. I will just say one other thing, just to have it back in mind, and this will finish, and next week we'll carry on more in the Psukim, is interestingly, what does this story remind us of? This story reminds us of, actually, I would say, a very basic fear that people have that's repeated in many cultures and also in the Tanakh, right? And that fear is that the king or the governor or the melech has access to other people's wives and women, right? Which strengthens the indictment against David, right? We know this again in the Gemara, right? The talk in Ketubot there that talks about it, that the Romans would take the Jewish women as well on the night of their of getting married. Again, historically, when and if that happened, in which cultures and everywhere else is a question, but it's also in Bereshit with the Avot when they go to Gra and right, and also Shechem even, right, with Dinah and Shechem. This right, this is something that comes up again and again in our culture and in other cultures. This kind of basic fear that the king oversteps his boundaries, and here that's also this going on, right? David takes someone else's wife and kills the person, right? It's something.
Doesn't the king supposed to walk with a Sefer Torah anyway to avoid? I mean, I don't. These people are still here. I would say in inverted commas, they're still human, but the king specifically had to have their own Sefer Torah, which they carried around with them all the time, so they were reminded of who was in charge. Doesn't necessarily mean that all the. I don't know what the Jewish kings that misbehaved, what their whether they did that. I doubt it, but definitely, especially someone like David, maybe at the time also maybe he wasn't as I can't remember if he was popular at that time or wasn't as popular. I don't know.
Be that as it may, all of these things tie into this question of David and what the text is trying to teach us, right? And I think the very fact that this exists in the text is in of itself a very important point to think about. But at the same time, it's important for us to also, we've read part of the Peshat. Next week we'll carry on reading the rest of the Peshat. It's important to think about how Chazal understand this, right? We don't read the Tanakh just in the Peshat. We also read it through the lenses of the Masorah, and to think about what that adds to us, and also to actually answer the question: did David sin? Did he actually sin? Right? And if he did, what was it? And what can that teach us? And for that, we'll leave it more to next week. I'm happy to take more comments or questions, but we've kind of overrun our time. Anyone want to say something?
I haven't read ahead, but do we know what Bathsheba's view is of all this?
Well, we do know that she was taken against her will, because it says Veikachea, which implies that she wasn't like a willing participant in the same level. We'll see how she acts and what she does. She has little choice, actually, right? And she seems to have little choice. But we'll see. We'll see what also Chazal say next week as well, and take it from there. But hopefully from here, just to get a sense of what's going on in the Peshat is very useful, and also from there to understand how the Masoret develops, right? Oftentimes people see, again, I spoke about this last time, right? See the Midrash as kind of, just what Chazal and the Masoret want us to think. When actually, if you read very closely in the Psukim, it's a dayah from within the Psukim. It's not just out of thin air, right? And that's very important. That's very important yesod, I think, to understand that Chazal read the Tanakh very, very closely, much more closely than we do, and also most other people that think they're experts in Tanakh read the Tanakh. And their dayah comes from important places. Yeah.
Just one thing, very, very quickly, you can tell me, we'll cover it next week or whatever. But is there anything between this and Yehuda and Tamar?
Is there anything between this and Yehuda and Tamar?
Yeah.
Yes.
Fine. Okay.
Interesting. That's it. We're done. No, interestingly, I think Nechama Leibovich talks about this as well. It's an idea that goes around. It's interesting to note that the line that goes from Yehuda seems to be involved in these issues of sexual impropriety at some level. Yehuda and Tamar, even Benot Lot, in that respect as well, a kind of part and parcel of this, which is perhaps a deeper message as well, about not about the immoral nature of Yehuda, Chas v'Shalom, and Malchut David, but actually probably more about the strength of tshuva, right, and the ability bemet to do tshuva and metaken, and the yesod that that Malchut Yehuda is not like Malchut Yosef, so to speak, right, but has with it an element which is this worldly, but an element that is able to take, and perhaps this is a good place to end, take this worldly, the failures of humanity, and to turn it into schuyot, really, and that's an important yesod.
That's what feeds into Moshiach. That's the idea.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, have a Shabbat Shalom. Good to see everyone. Thank you for
And
joining.
thank you.
And we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye.
See you next week.